Dan Bongino leaned closer to his microphone today, stating he intended to demonstrate she was the greatest charlatan in the history of Congress. He delivered the line with the calm demeanor of a meteorologist reading a forecast, presenting it as a basic fact that everyone present would shortly recognize as reality. The House Oversight Committee chamber fell completely quiet, as every camera lens, journalist, and staff member seemed to freeze where they stood. Then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez laughed, not out of nervousness but as a performance, the specific type she rehearsed before mirrors to signal this man was beneath her and which played beautifully on Instagram Reels. "Oh, this ought to be entertaining," she thought, as she adjusted her own microphone while the studio lights caught the perfect angle of her $3,000 blazer. Her stylists had selected that specific jacket for its on-camera appeal after spending 45 minutes applying her makeup earlier that morning. This was intended to be her highlight, another viral video where she dismantled a Republican witness, thinking a failed police officer turned podcaster was hardly the one to lecture her on fraud. She paused for dramatic effect while scanning the room with exaggerated skepticism, asking if he planned to sell her gold coins, or perhaps emergency food rations for the end of the world. Scattered chuckles emerged from the Democratic side of the aisle, while several aides retrieved their phones to record what they presumed would be another signature takedown. She felt entirely in her element now because this was her specialty and her identity as the queen of comebacks, the social media gladiator, and the voice of a generation. "Perhaps you should restrict yourself to yelling into a microphone for upset baby boomers," she continued, suggesting he leave the actual work to those who truly comprehend policy. More laughter followed, and an aide gave a thumbs up, yet Bongino remained motionless, sitting perfectly still with hands clasped, observing her display with the patience of someone who served 12 years in the Secret Service. He had guarded presidents and confronted authentic dangers, so he knew how to wait. And as the laughter died down and the silence lengthened, Ocasio-Cortez's smile wavered for just a second. She was unaccustomed to adversaries who refused to react because she thrived on their responses and required them. But Bongino simply asked if she was finished in a flat, unimpressed tone. "I am only just beginning, tough guy, because you represent everything wrong with the world," she said, just as Bongino reached down to open his briefcase, which was made of worn, practical leather, without any ostentation. "So am I," he replied, retrieving a single folder that was neither thick nor dramatic, but simply a plain manila file with a typed label, placing it on the table so every lens could capture the text. The label read, "Ocasio-Cortez the fraud," causing the room to stir with ripples of whispers, while Bongino let the words $47 million hang in the air, refusing to rush as he gave the figure space to resonate. "That is the amount of capital that moved through your network of PACs, LLCs, and shell corporations over 4 years, totaling $47 million from individuals who believed in your cause." He opened the file, stating he knew where every single cent went, including every transfer and every payment and every lie, looking directly at her with eyes that were steady and certain. "By the time I finish here today, everyone watching will know too," he said, pulling out the first document, adding that she should have remained a bartender, because that was at least an honest profession. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to retort and deliver a comeback, as she always did, but no words emerged because, for the first time in her political career, she had absolutely nothing to say. Dan Bongino was only getting started as he flipped to the initial section of the folder, moving with the methodical patience of a man who had constructed cases against cartels and shielded presidents from assassins. Every gesture was deliberate, and every pause was calculated as he suggested they start with something simple, proposing they discuss her living arrangements. Ocasio-Cortez rolled her eyes, with rehearsed dismissiveness, sighing that here came the right-wing obsession with her wardrobe, which was neither original nor creative. Not your clothing, Congresswoman, but your choices, specifically the massive canyon between what you preach and how you actually live your life, he said while extracting a lease agreement. You speak frequently about affordable housing, calling it a human right, claiming working families are being crushed by rent and pushed out of neighborhoods while being forced to choose between food and shelter. He placed the lease on the table, describing her apartment in Navy Yard, D.C., costing $3,500 a month, a luxury building featuring a rooftop pool and a state-of-the-art gym with a 24-hour concierge. He looked up at her, noting that rent is more than most families in her district earn in an entire month. Not just their rent, but their total income from working 2 or 3 jobs combined. Ocasio-Cortez shifted in her seat, and her posture changed slightly, which the cameras caught, as she argued that price was standard for D.C. housing since members of Congress must maintain 2 residences. Bongino withdrew another document, which was a spreadsheet with highlighted rows, showing a list of available apartments within 2 miles of the Capitol under $2,000, with some under $1,500 that were modest places where working people actually live. He set the list down, noting she did not want those because she desired the luxury building with amenities her constituents will never experience, one costing more per month than some earn in 6 weeks of full-time labor. He paused to say, "There is nothing wrong with wanting nice things or enjoying success, but there is something wrong with building a political brand on telling others they cannot have nice things while living in luxury yourself." Ocasio-Cortez's attorney leaned over to whisper something, but she waved him away with irritation. So Bongino moved to the next exhibit to discuss the Green New Deal, which was her signature legislation that made her famous. He produced a thick document, recalling how she stood on the House floor, calling climate change an existential threat, claiming we have 12 years to act before the world ends, and that every American must radically change how they live and travel and consume. He revealed a spreadsheet showing 66 flights in 12 months exposed in FAA records, all in first or business class, noting her personal carbon footprint from air travel alone exceeded that of 20 average American families combined in a single year. He set the spreadsheet down, stating she wants working people to give up cars and stop eating meat, and fundamentally transform their lives to save the planet, but looked at her, noting that first class is certainly more comfortable. Ocasio-Cortez grabbed her microphone, with her voice pitched higher, claiming those were work-related flights for official congressional business, to which Bongino responded by pulling out a photograph and holding it up so every camera could see it clearly. This is Miami Beach in February 2021, while Texas was freezing and people were literally dying without power, showing the photo of Ocasio-Cortez in a bikini with a champagne glass laughing in a beach cabana. You flew to Florida for a fundraiser at a beachfront mansion while your colleagues organized relief efforts and your constituents in New York dealt with their own winter weather emergencies. He set the photo down, explaining the image was posted by a friend on Instagram and deleted within an hour when someone noted the optics, but reminded her that nothing ever truly disappears from the internet. He pulled out another image showing her 2 days later back in New York, tweeting about climate justice and the urgent need for the Green New Deal, looking at her with near pity while remarking the champagne on the beach was surely nice. Ocasio-Cortez's face flushed red as her hands gripped the table edge, starting to say it was previously scheduled. But Bongino interrupted to move on because he was not interested in explanations while building his case. You champion defunding the police, saying communities do not need armed officers patrolling streets, and that money should go to social services or mental health workers or community programs or anything but cops. He spread out a new set of documents detailing her personal security expenses for the last 2 years, exposed through financial disclosures that her office tried very hard to bury in paperwork. He pointed to numbers showing over $70,000 in black and white, looking at her to note she hired armed private security with guns to keep her safe while telling single mothers in the Bronx they do not need police protection. "That is completely different, because I receive credible death threats," she started. But Bongino's voice hardened as he countered that the single mother working night shifts, or the elderly man walking from church, or kids crossing gang territory face them too. They face real and constant threats every single day. He paused, noting the difference is they cannot afford $70,000 in private security. Yet she wants to remove the only protection they possess. The room was completely silent now, with even keyboards stopping as Bongino pulled out one more set of documents regarding her staff, the young idealists who believed in her message and wanted to join her movement. He read from an official filing of anonymous complaints with the Office of Congressional Ethics, adjusting his glasses to read highlights stating she demands absolute loyalty, but treats staff like servants where unpaid overtime is expected, and complaints meet threats of career consequences. He flipped to another page, quoting that she preaches workers' rights on television, but runs her office like a sweatshop where interns work full-time without pay. Reading another quote that describes a public version who cares and a private version who screams at junior staff over coffee orders. He set the documents down, noting the champion of the working class cannot treat her own workers with decency. And while Ocasio-Cortez's voice cracked, claiming the complaints were unsubstantiated anonymous accusations, he retorted they were sworn statements filed under penalty of perjury. They came from people who worked for her and believed in her and saw who she really is when cameras aren't rolling. But Bongino closed that section, noting that living like a hypocrite is not a crime, but rather sad proof she does not believe a word she preaches. He opened the next section where pages were thicker and more dense, stating this is where they get to actual crimes, taking a slow breath because he understood pacing and how to build tension for the section that would end careers. "Let us talk about money," he said, specifically discussing the $47 million that flowed through her political network in 4 years, pulling out a complex diagram with lines connecting boxes and arrows, showing money flows tangled like a web. Brand New Congress PAC and Justice Democrats and Courage to Change PAC are 3 organizations connected to her moving money in patterns that would make a money launderer jealous, though Ocasio-Cortez forced a laugh, claiming they are legitimate organizations supporting progressive candidates. They were used to move money in circles until no one could trace where it went, Bongino said, holding up the diagram, offering to walk her through it step by step, simply enough for everyone watching at home to understand. He pointed to the first box where donations come into Brand New Congress PAC from small donors and working people who believed in her message about fighting corruption, giving $20 or $50 or whatever they could afford, even if they skipped meals. He traced a line on the chart showing money paid to Brand New Congress LLC, which is a private company for campaign services, then another line where that LLC pays a company called Middle Seat Consulting for more services. He looked up, asking if she wanted to guess who controls Middle Seat Consulting, answering the silence with her former chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, the man who founded Justice Democrats, and recruited her to run for Congress after discovering her at a casting call for progressive candidates. Bongino set the diagram down, explaining the money goes in a circle from PAC to LLC to consulting firm and back into the pockets of her inner circle, while millions simply disappear along the way into vague categories like operating expenses and consulting fees. He pulled out official filings showing Federal Election Commission records of over $1 million in payments that cannot be properly accounted for as documentation is missing and services are undefined, and the money just vanished. He spread the papers out, noting the FEC has received multiple formal complaints and investigated for years, but the only reason charges have not been filed is because the commission has been deadlocked along partisan lines. He looked at her, stating the FBI does not have that problem and has been looking at this very carefully. While Ocasio-Cortez's pale attorney wrote furiously, as Bongino continued that they should talk about something more specific, like her boyfriend. The room went very still, because this was personal now regarding Riley Roberts, her longtime partner. A nice enough guy, but not a political operative or strategist or communications expert, since his background is in web development. He set down payment records showing her campaign and associated PACs paid Riley Roberts $6,000 a month for over a year for marketing consulting. Doing the math aloud to show that is over $72,000 from donor money. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez, asking what he produced and what campaigns he created and what strategies he developed, but as the silence stretched, he answered for her that there was absolutely nothing. There is no portfolio and no documented work product and no evidence he did anything to earn that money. Just checks written to her boyfriend from funds donated by working people supporting a political movement. Ocasio-Cortez's voice rose defensively, claiming Riley provided valuable digital strategy, but Bongino cut through her explanation, demanding she show the committee a single piece of work he produced. He asked for one strategy document or campaign creative or email chain, but she didn't respond. So he noted he reviewed every filing and his name appears only on payment records and never on actual work. He pulled out another paper saying, "Here is where it gets interesting," introducing Maria Gonzalez and letting the name settle, describing her as a single mother of two in the Bronx district she claims to represent. He set down a printed statement explaining Maria works 2 jobs cleaning office buildings at night and folding clothes at a laundromat by day, making about $14 an hour with no benefits or sick days. He looked at the document, noting that in 2018, Maria donated $50 to the campaign, which represented a full day's wages for her and forced her to skip groceries that week to afford it. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez, saying she believed in her and watched her videos, seeing someone who looked like her and talked about her struggles while promising to fight for people the system had forgotten. He tapped the payment record for Riley Roberts, stating Maria's $50 helped pay her boyfriend $6,000 a month to produce nothing, lowering his voice to add that Maria skipped meals while her donation subsidized a boyfriend's lifestyle. Ocasio-Cortez blinked rapidly with eyes getting wet from either emotion or calculation, claiming it was a gross mischaracterization of campaign finance. But Bongino pulled out an email printout to read something to her. This is an email from her personal account to Saikat Chakrabarti, dated March 15, 2019. He read slowly for the microphones, quoting her instruction to make sure transfers don't look connected and to ensure small donors never find out who really benefits. He set the email down, stating this is not staff making accounting errors or confusion about finance regulations, but rather her personally and directly instructing her chief of staff to hide where the money went. A Democratic committee member shifted uncomfortably while the ranking member stared at the table, refusing eye contact. As Bongino noted, she told Maria Gonzalez and thousands of others their money funded a movement and a revolution against the establishment. Bongino's voice hardened, saying it funded her inner circle and boyfriend and lifestyle. Pulling out a final document showing the total donor money going to entities controlled by her associates was $4.2 million. He let the number $4.2 million sit in the air. Money from people like Maria Gonzalez, who sacrificed because they believed she was different. Then closed the section, noting That is only the money traceable to American donors. Not all the money came from Americans, he said, opening the next section where the story gets really dark, turning to a new tab with photographs clipped to the top that were images which had shaped history. June 24, 2018, was a date that transformed her entire career and made her a national figure. He began, holding up the famous photograph of Ocasio-Cortez at the Texas border fence, with tears streaming down her face in an image of compassion, confronting cruelty. This image went viral within hours and was shared millions of times, launching countless news segments, turning her from a long-shot challenger into a national icon as he set it down gently and almost reverently. A young Latina congresswoman overcome with emotion at the sight of separated immigrant children was powerful and moving, and exactly what the moment needed. He paused, but added, "There is just one problem with that narrative." He held up another photograph, taken 5 minutes before the famous shot at the same location by the same photographer, who kept all his images and was kind enough to share the complete sequence with federal investigators. The second photo showed Ocasio-Cortez in the same white outfit at the fence, but laughing with staff and checking makeup in a phone screen, while a third image was taken 12 minutes after the crying photo. It showed Ocasio-Cortez smiling broadly, posing for selfies with supporters without a tear in sight, proving her grief lasted exactly as long as needed for the shot, approximately 5 minutes sandwiched between smiles. Ocasio-Cortez shook her head vigorously, claiming those photos were taken out of context, and she was genuinely overwhelmed. But Bongino asked if she really was while pulling out a text message log. This is from her communications director, sent 3 hours before she arrived, reading a quote to make sure photographers are positioned for the emotion shot, and to have tissues ready, and to tell her to think of something sad to get tears going. He set it down, noting her team called it the emotion shot, rather than a genuine moment of compassion, describing it as a performance manufactured for maximum political impact before pulling out another text exchange. This one is from her to her campaign manager 2 hours after the photos, reading a quote that the crying pic is blowing up and will be massive for fundraising, so they must capitalize before the news cycle moves on. The children in those facilities were real, and their fear and confusion and suffering were real, he said, looking directly at Ocasio-Cortez, adding that she used them as props for a fundraising email. Ocasio-Cortez's voice cracked with perhaps genuine emotion, claiming she cares deeply about those children and fought tirelessly for reform. But Bongino asked if she really had while pulling out a calendar document. This is her official congressional schedule for the 2 years following the photograph to count how many times she visited a border facility, he said, flipping pages, revealing the answer is 0. She never went back because the photo op was enough, he said, noting she did find time for 427 media interviews and magazine shoots and documentary appearances while raising over $11 million off immigration appeals. He set the papers down, stating she never found time to do anything substantive about the problem, spreading out social media posts where she called facilities concentration camps and compared agents to Nazi guards, while claiming America operated state-sponsored terror. He looked at her, noting those were strong and inflammatory words designed to generate maximum outrage and donations. Pulling out a document to show those words also put targets on the backs of federal agents doing an impossible job. He read an incident report where 3 agents were assaulted by protesters, citing her rhetoric, including Agent Manuel Padilla, who was hospitalized for 2 weeks with a concussion and broken ribs, while his wife and children wondered if he would ever be the same. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, but nothing came out. As Bongino noted, she got headlines while Agent Padilla got brain damage. Moving to the next page to examine her actual legislative work beyond tweets and news appearances. He held up a thin document representing every piece of immigration legislation she sponsored in 4 years, flipping through pages of resolutions and non-binding statements and symbolic gestures designed solely for social media engagement. He set it down, stating, "Not a single substantive bill became law, nor did any policy change help an immigrant family," calling it just performance as he pulled out financial records showing something interesting happening with her fundraising. He spread out documents showing open border advocacy groups pushing for abolishing deportations donated heavily to her PACs after the photo went viral, pointing to specific line items. Some of these organizations have been flagged by law enforcement for connections to people who profit from chaos at the border, causing Ocasio-Cortez to slam her hand on the table, calling it an outrageous and racist insinuation. Bongino held up a DHS report from an investigation into funding networks undermining border security, noting her PACs received donations from 3 groups specifically named in the report. He set it down, asking if she checked where the money came from or did any due diligence, answering the silence by saying she just cashed the checks and kept performing as he leaned forward. Every year, thousands of migrants die crossing the desert because they were told the border was open, and women are assaulted and children trafficked, while families pay savings to criminal organizations who leave them to die. His voice was hard now and closer to anger, stating she profits from chaos and fundraises off suffering while building a brand on the bodies of people she claims to care about before closing that section. Yet exploiting immigrants for donations isn't even the worst thing she has done, he said, opening the final major section, claiming the worst thing is what she really thinks about the people who voted for her. Bongino paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter and almost sad, saying, "This part will hurt the most. Not for her, because she already knows what is in there since she lived it." He looked toward the gallery and cameras, stating this will hurt the people watching at home who believed in her as a symbol of hope, then opened the folder, suggesting they start with Amazon. Ocasio-Cortez visibly stiffened as her hands gripped the table, while he recalled 2019 when Amazon announced plans for a headquarters in her district, pulling out projections for 25,000 professional jobs with high average salaries. It meant direct investment of over $2 billion into the community with tax revenue for schools, but he spread out clippings showing she led the opposition and organized protests, calling it corporate welfare. She said tax incentives were a giveaway to a billionaire, so he pulled out a statement showing it worked, and Amazon pulled out, taking those jobs and billions of dollars in investment to a different community. He looked at her, noting she celebrated it as a victory for the people, asking a victory for whom exactly, before pulling out an email from her personal account sent to a donor 1 week after Amazon withdrew. He read slowly, quoting that the Amazon thing worked out better than expected because tech workers would have gentrified the district, and it is better to keep the current poor voter base who depend on government programs because they are reliable. The hearing room was absolutely silent, as Bongino slowly said she didn't kill those 25,000 jobs on principle, but because financially secure and well-educated voters might not need her anymore. He set the email down, lamenting 25,000 chances for families to build wealth and achieve the American dream, looking at her to say she killed it deliberately because their success threatened her political power. Ocasio-Cortez was shaking with a strangled voice, claiming the email was not what she meant. But he demanded she explain to the people in her district what she meant by saying it is better to keep them poor and dependent. She couldn't answer, so Bongino pulled out phone records, noting Amazon was cold calculation. But this next part is personal, regarding what she really thinks about the people who trusted her, holding up a thick printout. These are text messages from her personal cell phone obtained legally through a warrant for the finance investigation, finding a specific page dated March 15, 2021, sent to a college friend from Boston University. He read slowly, quoting that these Bronx people are easy to manipulate if you say socialism and throw in Spanish phrases, so they cheer like trained seals, causing gasps from the gallery as a staffer walked out. Bongino continued with the same conversation 2 minutes later, quoting that they will vote for her no matter what, because they are not smart enough to realize they are being played, causing more gasps and crying in the gallery. And then he read a quote saying, "The Bronx is just her brand, like a logo, and she would never live there again," setting the records down to emphasize these were her private thoughts written when she thought no one would see them. When she felt safe enough to say what she believes, Ocasio-Cortez whispered brokenly that texts were out of context venting, but he asked what context makes it acceptable to call voters trained seals, meeting only silence. He asked what context makes it okay to say they are too stupid to know they are being played, and what context makes calling her district a brand anything other than contempt. Not waiting for an answer. There is no context that makes any of that acceptable beyond her saying what she really believes when safe, he said, pulling out more documents to discuss who she actually employs to serve constituents. He spread out personnel records for 14 full-time staffers whose backgrounds he reviewed, pointing to data showing 12 are from out of state and 10 have Ivy League degrees, while only 2 actually grew up in her district. Only 2 are from the community she claims to represent, he noted, asking why the champion of the working-class Bronx cannot find workers there, before pulling out a document regarding her Hispanic outreach coordinator. That coordinator was raised in suburban Connecticut and attended Yale, and does not speak fluent Spanish, he said, setting it down, noting she had the right connections and schools as he pulled out more records. Meanwhile, there are young people in the district who would give anything to work in Congress. Kids from the Bronx public schools who know the community, he said, shaking his head. You never gave them a chance because they lacked the right pedigrees, Bongino said, pulling out one more piece of evidence to discuss her connection to the community and her heritage, causing Ocasio-Cortez to tense visibly. You present yourself as a Latina from the Bronx connected to Puerto Rican roots, he said, pulling out a transcript from a Univision interview last year where she attempted to answer questions in Spanish. Here is what a professional linguist said after reviewing the tape. Reading that the subject speaks Spanish at an intermediate tourist level with Americanized pronunciation and grammar, errors a native speaker would never make. The errors suggest someone who learned Spanish as a second language in school, he quoted, setting it down, adding that she performs being Latina for cameras using phrases as props, without having the actual language or connection. Ocasio-Cortez was crying now with mascara running, claiming her family is Puerto Rican, and this is a racist attack. But he replied, it is not an attack on Puerto Ricans, but an observation about her specifically. It concerns the gap between her performed identity and who she actually is, Bongino said with a voice softening to pity, noting she grew up in Yorktown Heights, which is a wealthy suburb with a high median income. It has nice houses and good schools and country clubs, he paused, adding, there is nothing wrong with a comfortable childhood or being fortunate, but looked at her stating that is not the story she tells. You tell people you are from the Bronx struggle, because that story sells better and gets donations and wins elections, he said, shaking his head slowly, accusing her of stealing the identity of her own community. You appropriated their struggle and pain to advance your career, while laughing in private that they believed you, he said, closing the folder, concluding that is not democratic socialism, but plain and simple fraud. The hearing room felt different now as the energy shifted completely from political theater to something quieter and sadder. while Ocasio-Cortez sat slumped in her chair with ruined makeup. The polished warrior who arrived that morning was replaced by something broken, as she said she wanted to respond, and had the right to answer the accusations through her crying voice. Chairman James nodded, stating the witness concluded testimony, and she may make a statement, so Ocasio-Cortez straightened, trying to find the fire that came naturally before, and summon the fighter who never backed down. "This is a political witch hunt," she began with a cracked voice pushing through, calling it a coordinated attack by right-wing forces, terrified of strong women, where evidence was twisted and weaponized. "It is by people who want to silence the working class," she said, looking at cameras for her audience, claiming they are afraid of her movement, so they dig through emails and private lives. "They look for anything to twist into scandal," she said as her voice gained strength, declaring she will not be silenced or intimidated or apologize for fighting for people who need a champion. She turned to face Bongino, calling him a failed cop and a conspiracy theorist peddling nonsense for money, labeling him a puppet for billionaires wanting to crush the dreams of ordinary Americans. She lifted her chin, stating nothing. He said, "Changes who she is," and as the room waited, Bongino slowly reached back into his briefcase, asking if she was done, pulling out a final document she should see. He set it on the table, revealing it was a cooperation agreement signed 6 months ago by Saikat Chakrabarti, her former chief of staff, causing the color to drain completely from Ocasio-Cortez's face. He has been talking to federal investigators for half a year, providing emails and records, meaning everything presented today came from the man who knows how her operation worked, because he built it. Bongino pulled out another document regarding her boyfriend Riley Roberts, noting he was interviewed twice by the FBI and provided detailed records of every payment received and exactly what he did to earn them, which was nothing. He spread another document across the table showing 4 former staff members gave sworn statements about working conditions, including unpaid overtime and verbal abuse and threats against anyone who complained. "You called this a witch hunt, but those chase imaginary enemies, whereas this evidence is real," he said, as Ocasio-Cortez turned desperately to her colleagues in the squad who had stood beside her through every controversy. She asked Ilhan and Rashida and Ayanna to say something because they knew it was political persecution, but Representative Omar studied her notes intently. While silence filled the room, Representative Clyde was fascinated by her phone, and Representative Presley looked away toward the gallery. And as no one spoke, Bongino said quietly that they are not coming to rescue her. "They knew this was coming for weeks and already made their choices," he said, pulling out a statement from Representative Omar released 45 minutes ago, claiming no knowledge of Ocasio-Cortez's financial arrangements. Another paper from Representative Tlaib, released this morning, stated that each congressional office is responsible for its own compliance, wishing her colleague well during this difficult period. Representative Presley has not released a statement but unfollowed her on social media yesterday and deleted every photograph of them together from the last 3 years, he noted, setting the papers down. "They saw the evidence and calculated the odds and chose to save themselves," leaving Ocasio-Cortez looking around with desperation at staff who avoided her eyes and colleagues who wanted to be elsewhere. The cameras were still rolling, capturing her collapse as she was utterly alone, whispering brokenly like a child that it wasn't fair because she was trying to help people and change things. Bongino's voice was tired and disappointed rather than cruel as he responded that maybe she was at the beginning, closing his briefcase while suggesting a version of her might have believed what she said. But somewhere along the way, she started believing she was special and rules didn't apply, thinking she was too important for accountability, and supporters were tools rather than citizens to be served. He looked at her with possible pity, stating he didn't think she was evil, but rather what happens when someone gets famous too fast with too much power and no one to say no. He thought she got lost between her first viral tweet and her 50th magazine cover, standing up to add that this doesn't undo the damage or return the money or fix the trust. Chairman James cleared his throat, addressing the room that the committee heard extensive testimony regarding potential violations of federal campaign finance law and wire fraud statutes and ethics standards. He paused, letting the words settle before directing staff to prepare a referral to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. Additionally, recommending the House Ethics Committee open its own investigation immediately. He looked at Representative Ocasio-Cortez, advising her to retain experienced legal counsel before adjourning the hearing with a sharp crack of the gavel, after which she tried to stand, but her legs failed. She grabbed the table for support with white knuckles and pushed away rushing staff with trembling hands, claiming she could walk herself, making it 3 steps before the camera flashes started. It was a blinding storm of light and noise, with reporters shouting questions about resignation and text messages and what she says to donors, and if she will cooperate with the investigation. She couldn't answer because words had abandoned her, even though they were always her weapon. And as the door closed, the cameras kept flashing, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already gone. Her career ended not with handcuffs, but with silence and closed doors, which was somehow worse. And the news spread faster than predicted, with video clips everywhere within an hour. Social media exploded, and every cable network cleared programming for coverage, while within 3 hours, the first quiet but careful calls for resignation came from members of her own party. In the Bronx, the reaction differed from Washington as Maria Gonzalez sat in her small apartment watching news coverage on an old television she couldn't afford to replace, though the images were clear enough. She held a 2018 donation receipt for $50 in her weathered hands from when she believed, as a local reporter had found her and knocked on her door looking for the human story. "I believed in her," Maria said quietly, in accented but clear English she practiced, recounting how she told her daughters to look at this woman who looks like them and came from nothing to fight for them. She looked at the faded receipt, saying she told her girls if they worked hard and stayed honest, they could do something important. And tears came slowly as she recalled skipping groceries to send that money. "I told myself it was an investment in our future, and someone who understood," she said, wiping her eyes, adding that she called them stupid and easy to manipulate while laughing with rich friends. The reporter asked what she wanted to say to Ocasio-Cortez, and Maria thought, before answering, that she broke something bigger than trust, making people like her afraid to believe in anyone ever again. She looked at the receipt, saying the worst part wasn't the $50, but the hope she stole, which she doesn't know how to get back. And similar scenes played out across the district into the night. In bodegas and laundromats and crowded apartments and late-night diners where working people ate, those who had believed watched their faith collapse in real time. They had given her votes and money and hope and dreams for something better, while she had given them a performance. And Dan Bongino did only one interview that evening after turning down others. The reporter asked if he was proud, but Bongino shook his head, saying proud is not the right word because there is nothing here to be proud of, pausing to choose his words carefully. A young woman destroyed her career through arrogance and greed, while thousands feel betrayed, and her district still lacks the jobs she killed, while the immigrant families she used as props still suffer. He looked at the camera, stating he didn't create the situation, but just exposed it with evidence, and the reporter asked if he felt any sympathy for Ocasio-Cortez. Bongino thought, before answering, that he feels sympathy for who she could have been, given her gifts of intelligence and charisma. noting she might have accomplished something meaningful if she used them honestly. He shook his head, saying she made different choices that led here, and later that night, Dan Bongino sat alone in his office with the television off and the evidence folder filed away for federal investigators. He thought about the young woman who entered Congress 4 years ago and watched her rise like everyone else, seeing the fire in her eyes and the certainty that she would change the world at 29. Somewhere she started making small choices, like a donor not questioned or an expense report fudged, until the small compromises became big ones and the private texts revealed what she really thought. The lies grew too heavy until the person she performed had nothing in common with who she was. Then his phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor about a new file arriving tomorrow with a different name but the same pattern. Bongino read the message twice and set his phone down, realizing there was always another politician who believed they were above the rules, trading principles for power and breaking promises to those who could least afford it. He filed the folder in his cabinet and turned off the light to head home to his family, knowing the work would continue tomorrow. And 3 days later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez submitted her resignation from Congress. The brief letter cited a need to focus on personal matters and family without admitting wrongdoing, nor did it apologize to donors or acknowledge the people she called stupid and easy to manipulate. The investigation continued without her as subpoenas were issued, and grand juries convened while the wheels of justice began to turn. And in the Bronx, Maria Gonzalez went back to the laundromat the morning after the hearing. She had bills to pay and children to feed, so she had no time for grief over political dreams. But she took down the poster on her wall with Ocasio-Cortez's face and the slogan about fighting for working families. She folded it carefully and placed it in the trash, realizing that some things once broken cannot be repaired.